Yeah, I've had this for a couple of days. I've intended to get to this, and I'm going to do it this hour because I'll tell you, it infuriates me. And this is something else being done on purpose that's being done to rip this country apart, and it's unconscionable. No, this business about Michelle Obama saying that museums are for white people. What's the point of this? Yeah, she said, when I was young, I would walk by museums, but I would know that's not for me. I'm not allowed in places that people don't want me. And black people to this day, museums, they know that that's not just for them. It was ridiculous. Why play the race card over something like that? Anyway, let's get to this in just a second. Greetings and welcome back. Rush Limbaugh here at 800-282-2882, the email address. lrushbo at eibnet.com. First Lady Michelle Obama gave a speech on Monday that was supposed to be celebrating the opening of a new museum. And it was a dedication, a $420 million dedication for a new building at the Whitney Museum in New York City on Monday. And a whole bunch of Democrat luminaries were there. Bill de Blasio, the mayor, the architect, Renzo Piano, and Michelle Obama. And instead of just congratulating the staff and praising the museum or whatever you do at a museum opening, she decided to lecture everybody about diversity. Everything has to be about race with these people. And we were supposed to be post-racial with the election of Obama. We're supposed to have put all that behind us. His election was supposed to mean something. It was supposed to signify that we had overcome and gotten past the original sin of slavery. And instead, as I knew would be the case, it's gotten worse by design, and this is one of the reasons why. Here, her husband is president, first African-American president in our history, and instead of lauding this new museum and whatever, these effete snobs at these museums do, to take the occasion here to widen the racial gap, she said museums and concert halls just don't welcome non-white visitors, especially children, the way they welcome white people. You imagine being in the audience for this? I mean, even if you're a committed liberal, you don't want to hear this stuff all the time, I wouldn't think. You hear a new museum dedication, and you want to hear an angry First Lady stand up and start complaining about stuff like this? Speaking at the new Whitney Museum in the Meatpacking District in New York, Michelle Obama said that she grew up thinking that museums were not places for someone who looks like me. No different than if I had a son, he would look just like Trayvon. You see, she said, there are so many kids in this country. You look at places like museums and concert halls and other cultural centers, and they think to themselves, well, that's not a place for me, for someone who looks like me, for someone who comes from my neighborhood. In fact, I guarantee you right now, there are kids living less than a mile from this museum who would never in a million years dream that they would be welcome in this museum. Can you imagine insulting the people who run the museum that you're there to dedicate? All for the purpose of stirring things up in the 7th year of your husband's presidency? Now, here's the thing. Michelle Malkin has this Twitter website called Twitchy, where she curates a bunch of different tweets, subject to subject and person to person. And according to the curation that she did on this, Michelle Obama's remarks went largely unnoticed outside of the event until a local radio host reported on it. Nobody at the event thought a thing of it. But there was a little blurb about it that some local radio host, don't know who heard about it, and museums as white spaces. The tone of her speech was eerily similar to her husband's remarks during the launch of My Brother's Keeper Alliance in New York City on Monday, in which Obama cites boys and young men of color being treated differently by law enforcement when it comes to stops and arrests. So she was just carrying forward a theme that her husband had laid down earlier in the week. By design, it was a strategy. There's a purposeful effort here to divide the people of this country along racial lines. Make no mistake about it. John Gabriel at Ricochet decided to write about this. And he said, instead of merely congratulating the museum staff and praising their mission, the First Lady decided to lecture them about diversity. And one of her claims struck me as quite odd. You see, there's so many kids in this country who look at places like museums and concert halls and blah, blah, blah. It's not a place for me, for someone who looks like me, for someone who comes from my neighborhood. This guy points out that he's been to Chicago. I've been to several Chicago museums on many occasions, whether I was at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Field Museum, Adler Planetarium, or the Museum of Science and Industry. The bustling crowds are made up of every ethnicity and socioeconomic status you could imagine. Buses brought in school kids from each neighborhood in Chicago and every suburb surrounding it. And I'm sure a young Michelle Obama participated in similar field trips many times. Meaning, she had to have been taken to museums when she did not grow up on a poor side of Chicago. She is not from the wrong side of town. Or as Johnny Rivers would say, the poor side of town. It's not as if she grew up in poverty, relegated to the South Side's infamous housing projects like some of my friends. This is, again, John Gabriel writing. The First Lady had a thoroughly middle-class upbringing in a stable nuclear family. Her excellent grades got her into Chicago's superb Whitney Young Magnet High School, where she was given one of the finest secondary educations in the state. Did this smart, successful student actually think Chicago's many popular museums were closed to someone who looks like me? For someone who comes from my neighborhood, did she never in a million years dream that she would be welcome in these places? Even though her school must have had field trips to most of them? He writes, I just find this incredibly hard to believe. So why does she continue to identify herself and people like her as oppressed, aggrieved victims rather than strong, capable winners? And you see, folks, that's the question. She wasn't excluded from anything in Chicago, ever. Why do, of all people, the president and the First Lady, historical by any stretch, pinnacle of achievement, talk about overcoming what some would say are impossible odds, why continue to run around angry and with a chip on your shoulder as though you are an aggrieved victim of something when you clearly are not? And why not instead take the occasion of your achievement and your accomplishment and motivate and inspire? If you remember my first nationally televised speech to the nation, remember that snurdly at CPAC? I chided Obama for this. Back in, this would have been 2009, February 2009, he'd just been immaculated. And I praised his oratorical skills, if the prompter's written right. And I said he's got so much potential, he could be so inspirational and so uplifting if he chose to, but no. It was true then and it's true now. I mean, it'd be one thing, you know, if they let somebody incarcerated out of jail to go help open a museum and started talking about being a victim and this and that, and I can't believe they let me out of jail to come to this museum. But she's the First Lady of the United States. Why not take the occasion of all this to inspire all these people? You ever stop to think maybe a museum and thing like that is not in their cultural upbringing and maybe it should be? You think maybe the reason they don't go there is because places like that are mocked and laughed at? Well, what's the popular phrase? They're too white? You don't go to a museum. It's too white. Nobody goes there. It's not cool. This is to me, you talk about a disservice to people. Museums are for white people, not welcoming someone like me, portraying herself and her husband as discriminated against victims. Can you imagine the good they could do with just a positive, mental, inspirational attitude? You realize how they could motivate and inspire people if they wanted to? Why don't they want to do that? They don't, obviously. They need victims. They need a permanent underclass. They need people thinking the deck's stacked against them. They need people who believe they need representation, representatives, people standing up for them because they can't do it on your own. Her senior thesis, if you remember, and I do because I'm me, Michelle Obama's senior thesis, remember where it was? Remember where she went to school? Well, it wasn't East Ovary U. It was Princeton. It was Princeton. It wasn't some place in the sticks. And her senior thesis was all about how out of place she felt there. And Sotomayor had a similar thesis at the same place. And both of them were filled with rage and anger. And there they are there. They are there. They got admitted. They're studying there. They're succeeding there. And their thesis, hers was about how out of place she felt. And it seems to me that Michelle Obama has spent a lot of her time as First Lady complaining about not feeling welcome. And you go back to the campaign, the first time she ever felt proud of her country, right, was when her husband was running for president. Well, yeah, but, you know, everybody that lives in the White House calls it a prison. I'm sure they don't look at the White House. I mean, they look at it as a prison because of security and they can't get out of there. But I don't. When she went to Spain, what's that got to do with? Where they welcome her everywhere. That's the point. They welcome her everywhere she goes. And they talk about her as a fashion leader and a fashion plate. They welcome her everywhere. It's a chip on the... just rein it in here, Rush. You're up to the edge already on this. You had to mention White House. Can you imagine what they really think of that place? Well, Obama said it. Michael, what do I think? He made a speech recently and referred to it as a place we and other slaves built. Remember that? Yes, right, it was at Selma. When they're commemorating the anniversary of what happened, the Edmund Pettus Bridge at Selma, in the movie, Selma. He did. He started talking about how the White House was built by, he used a personal pronoun somewhere in there. Anyway, so is it any wonder what's going on in Baltimore is going on? Is it any wonder what's happening in Ferguson, Missouri is going on?